Moving on to the last session of the day before the closing remarks. And we have a panel of experts that is going to be moderated by Adam Zwickey, Global Solution Engineer, from Tetrate. Many of you met him yesterday during the training. And we have fantastic panelists that are aligned here. I'll start with the ladies. So it's Aradhna Chetal, that is Senior Director Executive of Cloud Security at TIAA. And then we have Alex Shulman-Peleg, that is Managing Director at Ernst & Young. We have Robert Woods, CISO with the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services from HHS. Quinn van de Man, Principal Office of the CISO from AWS Security. And Vishwas Manral, and I apologize, that is the founder of Nanosec. Just a few minutes ago, Vishwas shared with me on the chat that his name actually means complete trust. So let's see if that's accurate. I don't know with the trust and verify, so how can we verify that, Vishwas? With that, I would like to pass the microphone to this fantastic line of panelists and start the conversation with them.
Thanks
Adam,
a lot,
please
Michaela.
take it.
Thanks a lot, Michaela. Well, we hope to have just that, a conversation. I think all the panelists should be able to see the chat. If not, I'll try and maybe interject some of the questions or guide the answers. But feel free to ask questions there, even though we do have a preset number of topics that we want to talk about. And also thanks to those that commented on some of the social media posts that our panelists and NIST and Tetrate posted that gave us some feedback of what you wanted to hear. I think for me, what I heard the most was, where do we start and where are we going to stub our toes? What's going to be hard? So hopefully we answer that as we go through our panelists. Though we've talked about Zero Trust a bunch, most probably still think of it as a little bit of a buzzword. So I think the first question, or the first thing, love to get your thoughts on is, what is it in your mind? Is it a product? Is it a methodology? Is it a service? How would you explain what Zero Trust is? And maybe we'll start with our ladies first. Aradhna, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Adam. Yes, I've had numerous conversations on LinkedIn about if only we could have a product that could implement Zero Trust. To me, Zero Trust is a paradigm or set of principles and operating procedures that enterprises can use to secure their IT landscape. The traditional method of having a hard exterior perimeter and assuming that you're secure doesn't work anymore. The threat landscape has grown. At the same time, enterprises are now expanding their IT landscape to cloud-native platforms. All the SaaS providers and contractors are on their network, and attackers know once they are on the network, they can move laterally and get access to multiple resources. So essentially, Zero Trust provides those principles, as we've heard all morning from Kelsey and Zach and others, that trust has to start somewhere. You need to have some trust, but how do you validate before you grant that trust? Like they say, trust has to be earned, right? So essentially, no explicit or no implicit trust, but trust is granted explicitly based on the attributes as well as the authentication method and level of assurance that a user, device, or application provides to get access to data and resources. And some of the key principles of Zero Trust are all data resources as well as applications and microservices are identified and tagged and labeled, so you know who is trying to access. And then all network communication, regardless of location, is secured and encrypted. And then also all users, devices, applications have to be authenticated and authorized based dynamically on a session basis, based on the level of assurance and intelligence or behavioral intelligence that is gathered on the posture and state of those users, applications, and devices, and then granted access based on the level of assurance and the policies defined to access a particular resource. In addition, there needs to be continuous monitoring and detection of the state of all the policy enforcement points and the users and devices, etc., so that policies can be dynamically updated based on the posture and state of the application, user, and device, etc. In a nutshell,
Excellent.
at high level, that's what I think Zero Trust is.
Sorry to interrupt you. So there's a lot packed in there. I think in the following, topics and questions, we'll maybe unpack a little bit that's more. Same question for you, Alex. What would you give as the definition? What would you add or modify with what Aradhna was mentioning?
For every component, without any trust assumptions on the environment or the platform users or tenants. And personally, I'm measuring zero trust, or the quality of zero trust implementation is the potential blast radius if something bad happens. So if zero trust is properly implemented, everything is scoped. So if one component is compromised, the damage is well scoped to the specific component. So that's the definition that I found useful, and just using standard control frameworks, we can check the implementation of the controls.
Great. Thank you for that. Sorry. And Robert, how about your thoughts?
Sure thing. So I've been sort of operating under this, like the way that I've been approaching it and explaining it is to describe zero trust as a model or a framework of operating principles and design principles that are based on the assumption of you assume that something is breached and you want to minimize and control impact and flow and potential lateral movement or spillage of resources or data or what have you in your environment to the extent possible. And as Aradhna mentioned, doing these explicit trust grants to allow movement or resource or data grants or what have you through your environment, and not necessarily based on any static implied attributes. So that's sort of how I've been like the working mental model that I've been using this since it became a hot buzzword on the market.
Okay, and Vishwas, since your name means trust, let's hear your thoughts. You're muted, Vishwas.
Sorry. Yeah, so I was going to say I'm going to start by defining trust because my name itself means trust, right? So this is a definition that I actually heard from from Anton Chuakin, this guy from Google, right? A famous analyst in the past. He said, trust is a human emotion that we've injected into digital systems for no reason at all, right? And when we're talking trust in the context of digital systems, we are basically saying we are inherently giving certain level of trust to a system, certain level of privilege to a system without actually explicitly doing authentication for it. So that's how I see it, right? So that's trust. And when I'm saying zero trust, it's basically what Aradhna said: never trust any entity, implicitly, right? And so that's how I see zero trust. The only thing that I'll add to what Aradhna said or Alex said or Robert already mentioned is my view of zero trust, because it's a set of principles. Not all the principles may apply everywhere, right? So it's not just about it's not just about network alone. So I'll give you an example, right? And this is where I see it in the market, and people get confused, saying, "Hey, why are they calling their product zero trust? It's not zero trust, right?" So the way I look at it is because it applies to zero trust means a set of principles and architectures that we're talking about, and if we are sort of say based on whatever authentication we can do for a user, right? As an example, an allow list, right? What we call or allowing only certain system calls for a particular process. If you're constraining that, based on past behavior of a process, I would call that also aligning to some aspects of zero trust, right? Basically, limiting the authorization of a process to what it has done in the past, even though I cannot necessarily authenticate the process by itself. I would call that zero trust. So that's the only thing I'll add, right? So it's not just about network. it's about principles, and the principles can apply not just when authentication is always there or authorization is always there and so on, right? So it's as long as you can apply certain principles, certain aspects, that's where I would say, you're actually working on the models of zero trust.
Great. And Quint, I'm very sorry to call on you last here. I mean, you can kind of say ditto and move on. What about your thoughts on this?
Sure, no worries. Actually, maybe it's good that I go last, because I've been asked that question a ton over the last couple of years, and I somewhat jokingly, but mostly not jokingly, say that that's really only a question that's relevant for happy hour, right? Like if we've all got tasty beverages and we want to debate the academic nature of the term or try to arrive at some uniform, precise definition, that's great when we're outside of the work environment. But inside the work environment, I find it just to be much more practical to do what I think a lot of the panelists also sort of agreed on is define it at a very broad level, something that everybody can get behind, establish some good guiding principles, and then use those guiding principles, apply them against use cases, and start working backwards to make meaningful and incremental progress towards better security rather than getting super hung up on definition.
Yeah, awesome. So, I mean, I think the takeaway from all that, to go to kind of what I alluded to at the start, is it a product, is it a service, what is it? So if anyone's telling, the members or the folks here on our conference, hey, I can give you zero trust, let me sell you to that in a product, that's not the case. It's about policies and an organizational change. But that kind of begs the question, so like, how do I start with that? Where do I begin to implement? What are the key building blocks for doing this? I know when we communicated earlier, Vishwas and Aradhna, you had some thoughts around this. So maybe this time, Vishwas, we'll start with you. How would you implement it? Where would you start? What are the key building blocks that the folks on this conference should be thinking about? Oh, you got muted again.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So what I was saying was, like it was already mentioned, zero trust is about, it's a set of principles. It's not a product. It's not a technology, right? It's not a particular implementation or a use case. So the way I look at it is sorry about that. I'm getting my phone call now. Sorry. Yep. So zero trust, because we talk of zero trust more as an architecture, my take is the key components or the key, the building blocks will depend on the use case itself, not necessarily on, the architecture by itself, right? So if you look at, however, certain components are going to be common across the various use cases, right? There has to be some identity provider, something that will work across the various, that provides identities in a secure way to the various entities that are part of the system. There has to be something, a system that is authenticating, these users based on context, that there's something that is sort of going to be authorizing the various identities, providing them the minimal possible, authorizations based on the context that is generated. So I think all those things come into picture. However, if you were to sort of implement the use case, right, the way I look at it is, it has to be looked at from various perspectives, right? It has to be looked at from a perspective of risk, right? From a level of risk. Hey, this is my organization. These are my objectives. What is the level of risk that I'm ready to take, and what do I need to first start off with? Right? That's how I look at it. So that's how I would sort of define what you'd say, the key functions or the key things that you want to start off with. So at a very high level, I mean, that's what I would say.
Gotcha. And Aradhna, you probably bring a really interesting perspective, because as in your intro, you're coming to us from a very large enterprise from TIAA. How would you answer that? What are the building blocks? Where do you start? How do you think about that for your organization?
Adam, I want to say zero trust is not new. This has been talked in the industry for a decade and a half. I was at Boeing Company 15 years ago when we were talking about deperimeterization. So concepts have been there in the industry. It's just that the landscape has broadened with cloud and cloud native and SaaS and everything in mobile devices, social interfaces with the world, right? Every organization has. So I will share some of the practical implementations or the methodology that I will take in this space. The biggest challenge is a lot of enterprises don't have all their data assets tagged and labeled. They don't know what is where. So having all your data assets identified and tagged and labeled is very important. All your services having identity is very important. I mean, in cloud and cloud native, it's very easy to get a service identity, but imagine legacy enterprise applications. They don't have application identities assigned to them. And then obviously authentication levels, right? A lot of enterprises are not even at MFA, right? So having different levels of authentication available to access different types of resources. And then policy management becomes a big piece of it, right? Where are you going to define policies based on what authentication level, what is the amount of access you can get? And then the whole dynamic nature of, your algorithms for calculating risk to be able to grant access. So the policy decision points, where will you place them? Depending on your IT landscape, you might need multiple policy decision points, and then keeping the policies synchronized across them can have some engineering challenges. And then policy enforcement points. A lot of enterprises have flat networks, or they have macro segmentation, but they don't have policy enforcement points. In cloud and cloud native technologies, it's very easy to use Istio. You can have Kyverno or OPA for policy management. You have observability, detection, everything built in, and all that comes easy. But when we are talking enterprise applications or traditional applications, that is where identifying where you're going to enforce policies and how you're going to segment those applications who cannot even talk to APIs, who are, traditional monolithic apps. So there you need to group them in an access zone, put a policy enforcement point in front of them so that that can act as a decision point for enforcing whatever controls and policies you want to enforce. Then the whole detection piece and dynamic nature of dynamically assessing the security posture of devices, applications, and users, right? The behavioral analytics piece, and then based on that, making your trust algorithms work and update them dynamically. Those are some of the areas where I think industry needs to evolve a little more, especially for traditional apps in an enterprise. There may be some products who can do that, but I haven't seen a great success in any products who can provide you that trust algorithm mechanisms and integrating with all the metadata and data that is needed to calculate that risk.
Mm-hmm. You hit on something interesting that, this isn't anything new that we've really been talking about for the past day and a half here. It's the IT landscape that's changed so dramatically with the legacy or the traditional data centers, cloud, and now just applications moving to cloud native. What we heard from those responding to this panel is what's going to be hard. What are going to be the biggest challenges? So I know a few of you said, "Oh, I'd love to share my thoughts." Alex, with EY, with your role, you probably see a whole ton of different organizations and enterprises. Where do you see the big obstacles, and how are you advising, how to get around the hard things?
Yes, thank you. I think actually we have wonderful tools. So from the engineering standpoint, we have many tools to do network segmentation and identity management. In the cloud, we have zero trust by design from the very beginning. And then we have these high-level policies talking about zero trust, but at a very high level. And I think the first next step that all of us need to do that will really resolve the situation and will move it forward is to translate these high-level policies to practical guidance that is platform specific and utilizing all the technologies. And we need to speak the same language, because today we have the engineering language and we have the high-level policy language. We need to bring these two together, and we need to translate policies that are written on paper to policy as code and configuration of the tools in a way that will be convenient for developers and everyone to adopt. And then we need to define metrics for the adoption to measure zero trust adoption. And bring all this together will also bring all the organizational components together, bringing policy, risk and control, and engineering together, and then just measuring, are we adopting zero trust?
Excellent.
But it is bringing the new school and the old school together. I think it's about time.
Mm-hmm. And Rob, what are your thoughts on the challenges? I'm sure you see, very complex environment in your role within, government agencies. what are the challenges organizations face? Why is it hard for most?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of reasons why it's going to be challenging to sort of get to the, push the rock up the hill that is, aligning to all the different pillars and doing all the things and like the maturity models and stuff for zero trust. There's, one of the biggest challenges I think is this sprawl and federation of different like funding sources, team sources, technology types, and even like system types. You've got some applications running these totally cloud native, really kind of cutting edge apps, and others are operating in a totally like the exact opposite world of on-prem brick and mortar data centers that are going through much slower development life cycles, and then you've got everything in between with hybrid systems or cloud systems that are built in old school ways. There's just a huge sort of spectrum, it's like a multi-dimensional spectrum. And so as far as like just getting things like started inside of these big enterprises, like I love the idea of having this, having like the pristine environment that if you adopt it, like the platform sort of model that you adopt it, you invest heavily in that tooling, and you get these, you get some of these benefits by default, by through adoption. It's kind of the same principle of using more secure development frameworks and getting benefits like auto output encoded things when you're doing web application development, or safe SQL queries and things like that. So you're sort of protecting yourself from known risks just by extension of using the library or the framework, and then you can sort of push and encourage adoption of those things, like what Alex mentioned, having usage metrics. If your usage drives your impact, like if you have usage metrics that drive impact metrics, like that can be a really powerful thing. So like the platform sort of pristine environment approach, I think there's a lot of merit to that, because it becomes your conversation shifts from like, how am I going to do this, to how am I going to migrate an application into this environment, and how do I cover the use cases, which is a way different conversation to have, and I think in some ways a lot easier to do, especially for but that's not going to cover all your use cases or all application types. And so for those that are not going to move into into such an environment, you can't just kind of leave those things to the wind, or you may not want to, depending on your risk appetite and what maybe mandates that you have, especially being in the federal government space, is so I think for environments that are not going to be following that, like pristine zero trust model, aligned on all the pillars, I think you have to kind of start small. Like you have to figure out like what reusable components might you be able to invest in along the lines of identity or devices or data or application frameworks or something, and like figure out how you can find like the 80-20 sort of through lines in reusable components. And if you can invest small amounts or smaller amounts of work and attention and tuning, etc., to into a shared component, that then you end up automatically improving the whole just by virtue of it being a shared component. Like that I think is a good way to start, and then continuously driving for more. You got to kind of continuously like reassess and measure your baseline.
Yeah, and so I think if I unpack what you said a little bit there, many organizations, it might be hard because they have a little bit of just paralysis by analysis. They don't know where to start. So that seems like a really pragmatic way just to get the ball moving and start rolling that ball in the direction that you want to go. Lastly,
I think it's like it's such a big thing that it's like if you think about like I'm gonna you know, I want you to like just boil the ocean for me. Like, you know, where do you, like, where and how do you even start? And so just doing something, and I think like finding those areas of, you know, shared infrastructure, shared resources, it at least like starts to invite, you know, it starts to invite opportunity instead of, you know, this just immense challenge that you can't necessarily get your arms around. Like, you know, maybe everyone's on the same sort of identity, you know, management stack. And if that's the case, great. You know, maybe you can start to do something with respect to that. You know, maybe all devices, you know, user workstations are all sort of provisioned and managed out of the same, you know, centralized, you know, business unit or you know, office. If you're talking about a agency, like, great, okay, like, you know, let's talk about like what we can do there, and then, you know, see the effects kind of you know, spill out through that work.
Great. And lastly, Quinn, sorry, I keep asking you the question last out of them. Your thoughts on, you know, the complex hybrid environment challenges that organizations start to hit. How to get around that?
Yeah, sure, no worries. With a name like Van Diemen, I've been at the end of the list my whole life, so no sweat there. You know, I guess you know, the first way I was going to answer your question, I think, has been covered pretty well already, right? And that's about, you know, I find that some organizations try too hard to achieve standardization of implementation rather than standardization of outcome, right? If you take those principles, you're probably going to apply those principles different to the cloud, you know, than you are, you know, a 20-year-old on-prem environment, right? The other way, and maybe the way that I don't think I've heard sort of discussed yet that I'd love to offer for the audience, is I think that some people get too focused on zero trust being the what rather than zero trust being the how, right? As we went about zero trust within Amazon, you know, the real what we were trying to achieve was workforce mobility, right? Like all these on-call engineers being able to silence the false alarm from their phone at a son or daughter's swim meet or baseball game. And zero trust was the how we got there, and all the great security with it came along for the ride. But by making zero trust the how and not the what, we had application teams and users, and like the demand swelled from the grassroots rather than it feeling like a top-down security mandate that was yet another thing that had to go on the pile of must-dos and compete with features. So I think that was pretty insightful for our own journey, and I'd like to think others could benefit from it as well.
Yeah, that's excellent. Now a follow-up, you know, because as we all chatted beforehand, we definitely wanted to get, you know, some of your opinion or thoughts on service mesh, micro-segmentation, how that plays in here. I know, Quentin, you said you had some thoughts on that. So the role of service mesh in all this, allowing things like micro-segmentation of where applications live and reside, especially across clouds. What role does it play?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's been one of the most, the simple answer is I think it plays an imperative role, right? You know, what's been interesting to me about the conversation, particularly over the last year and a half, is it's just been hyper-focused on that human to app use case. And, you know, maybe that's because it's a very salient use case. It's sort of the easiest one to try to explain to somebody who isn't really in, you know, this buzzword bingo or sort of the technology. But when you really start, again, thinking about what are we ultimately trying to do here? We're trying to cut down unnecessary pathways through networks, particularly ones that lead to data. More often than not, the infrastructure, the workloads, the microservices, however you want to label the terms, you know, that's where really the majority of this key data is flowing. And absolutely, it's got to go sort of hand in hand with that user to app work, you know, use case. But I think that if we're not addressing, you know, the inside the workload, zero trust of the workloads in between them, we're not ultimately going to really get to, you know, the types of security models and control sets that are going to prevent many of the breaches that and terrible things that happen that sort of really crack the egg open on you know, us wanting to get serious about zero trust.
Awesome, thank you for that perspective. And Vishwas, given your history, you know, probably your introduction didn't give it justice, but you know, I know you've been in the service mesh space for quite a long time, are now in McAfee, you know, helping with that product and as they embrace that. Same question, that role of mesh and microsegmentation and achieving zero trust in general.
So I'll come from, because you talked history, right? I will come from that measure, right? When we started service mesh, I think everybody agreed to the principles, right? We said, everybody knows and understands the principles of zero trust, agrees with the fact that, hey, we want to minimize the attack surface, right? Lateral movement and so on. The big challenges, I'll however tell you what we had were, when we went to a lot of big companies, right? A lot of big CISOs, one of the biggest challenges we had was, hey, yes, we love that micro segmentation, but is our organization ready to accept it? Right? That was a very big challenge that we had. So we had people who would say, we have all these data centers that we have in our environments, but we have not even segmented those data centers. We've not kept assets apart that shouldn't be communicating with each other. And in fact, it's not even done at a data center level. So issues in one data center could cascade into another data center. So micro-segmentation comes in much later. So I think that is one challenge we saw. The second challenge, now when you're talking about service mesh and something at that level, the challenges that we saw were related to the fact that, when we talk to the security teams and security groups, the biggest challenge we saw over there was, even if you talk in the cloud, people were running Kubernetes clusters on EC2 instances, right? AWS EC2 or compute instance. And the challenges that we saw over there were security teams wanted to enforce and implement and push their policies to all these environments, right, in an automatic way. But in a lot of cases, they were not even aware of these environments, right? They were not aware of what where these Kubernetes clusters were running, or how they could push these policies. And that's where, if you look at most of the security companies that are coming out right now, right, or that are doing very well, if you look at where they're in the first phase of security. If you look at the 5 steps of 5 functions of security, which is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? My take is segmentation comes in between protect and detect somewhere, right? Most of the companies are, however, stuck at that identify phase, and that's the kind of challenge that we have. So to be broadly adopted, I think we need to get to that every organization has to be ready, already past that identify phase, and then the detect, like I said, and the sort of the protect phase will come in next, which is where the segmentation thing comes in. So that's how I see it. So from my perspective, it's important functionality. Segmentation is very critical for the more mature organization. That's something that helps secure their applications, secure their data, secure their organization in a better way. However, if we look at it from where a lot of the big organizations are and where you see all the security companies currently focusing, it's been focused on more on the identify phase. And that's why, as a company, we had a lot of challenges when we started off that journey. So yeah, I mean, I just gave you the history, but also where I see it.
Yeah, and Aradhna, how polite. I see you raising your hand. Something to add there.
Yes, definitely. So I agree with Vishwas. A lot of application teams don't even know what all their applications talk to. So the requirement from the security products is that first they need to have a learner module, right, which can learn the traffic patterns before you can start enforcing those policies. And a lot of service mesh products did not provide that capability. So when things become too difficult, developers are not going to follow it, right? We have to make it developer friendly so that they can adopt those technologies and start following the security principles.
Yeah, and probably one of the key things that bubbles up to the top when you say, well, what do I talk to? What I connect to is going to be the data subsystems, and those are probably some of the most important things that need to be protected. So Aradhna, you mentioned you had some thoughts or wanted to comment on the controls, what threats need to be considered when we look at our data systems. So I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, and that has been my pet peeve for years, actually, in the industry. Most enterprises don't have their data identified. They don't even know where their crown jewels are, right? How do you segment and, build security models around that? So it's really, really important as part of Zero Trust. The OMB memorandum that came out yesterday also defines that data is one of the verticals that need to be addressed as part of Zero Trust. All data resources need to be identified, tagged, and labeled. In cloud, it's fairly easy. Cloud providers are providing tools to tag, label data. They have key management services. You can encrypt data based on the classification of the data with the appropriate encryption technologies. And then you can define access policies for the keys and so on and so forth. Same thing needs to happen for on-prem databases and data stores, etc. Also, to bring data security to zero trust model, it's really important to, again, do very fine-grained attribute-based access control for data, right? Based on context. For example, if a user is trying to access a file, then what is the device posture, whether they are on corp network or a trusted device, and which application they are trying to access, whether they're authorized based on those attributes to access that data element or not. So there can be a level of assurance on the data elements, as well as the level of assurance based on the user's attributes or device or applications attributes. And then there can be a policy that can provide you an algorithm whether or not that entity should get access to that data element or not. And that is really possible with the service mesh and all the policy enforcement points that can be deployed and the policy decision points which provide that algorithm to calculate the risk values based on the data classification, tagging, and attributes of the data or metadata that the data is tagged with, right? That is the ultimate panacea, but I don't know if we are gonna get there so soon, because a lot of enterprises have their data offices now working on identifying and labeling data. And same thing goes for cloud providers. I mean, we were talking about implicit trust. In a lot of these cases, there are threat scenarios where if two admins of a cloud provider collude, they can potentially get access to the data, right? Understand that cloud providers have all their detective controls in place where they will watch for those kind of behaviors. But then there could be very, very sensitive data where you could require application layer encryption based on the type of data. Application layer encryption means you're encrypting the data with a key. Even if somebody gets access to the key, they cannot get access to the data unless they have access to the application through which the encryption engine has encrypted the data. So all these nuances need to be considered within the use cases and the sensitivity of the data, and then apply zero trust principles and controls that we have been discussing.
Excellent, awesome. One of our last questions to wrap up, we wanted to kind of talk about what are like the biggest obstacles you've seen, either in your organization or in the industry in general. And I think there's actually a really interesting question that came in that kind of weaves into this, because AJ commented from a developer perspective, or the developer-centric piece is important, but some of this seems super complicated, especially probably to developers and app people who this isn't their native language they speak, and they dig in and they kind of say, oh, this is something there be dragons. I got to avoid that. So maybe as you comment on, what has been the challenges for your organization, putting on that developer hat or kind of the end user who's not the security professional, you could provide some insight on how we can bring them into the boat with us. Maybe Alex, we can start with you on that one.
Yes, thank you. To my opinion, the main challenge is actually the organizational complexity and the structure that we have today in most of the large enterprises, and the perimeter security mindset. Because given this perimeter security mindset, organizations were structured in silos. For example, to create this dedicated parts of the organization to deal with identity and access management, with network. Then also platform teams are separated from developers, and they're just building the platform. And then the security teams are just operating the security tools. In most of the zero trust products, we're actually merging all of these functionalities together. For example, adding security over service mesh. Then who should own these products? Because security teams, even if they understand the need for this, they cannot independently operate these products because they need expertise in service mesh. They need to know how to run such platforms. But then the platform teams, they don't have the security motivation and the cybersecurity budget to bring these tools. And then developers are getting lost in all of this because in the perimeter security mindset, they were told, don't worry, we'll create a secure environment for you. you don't need to do anything. We'll take things under control. But then developers are saying, okay, things are not under control. We don't have convenient tools. We're required to implement zero trust, but we don't know how. So I think building this into the organizational structure with roadmap for each functionality is what is needed to resolve this.
Excellent. Probably with any technology shift, that's usually the theme that bubbles up, like organizational change, silos that need to get knocked down. So not surprising to hear that at all. Rob or Robert, I know you shared a bunch on challenges earlier. Do you have additional anything specific to add on, like what you've seen in your org or the industry in general?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to plus one what Alex said, like basically it's like Conway's law, sort of manifesting in a really gnarly way that recognizing that the way you structure your orgs and your work and your plans and your budgets and all of that, I think plays a huge part into this. I should also, I think it's also worth noting, like I've had far more intelligent conversations with developers and like full stack engineers and those kind of folks, around service mesh than I have with many security folks. And so I think the challenge or the sort of framing of the part of the question of like, things have to be complicated or things have to be easy enough for like the developers understand. I totally agree with that sentiment, generally speaking, but I think our profession also needs to experience a sort of evolution of sorts to talk more developer language and to recognize that this is becoming a developer first, like developer as a first class citizen sort of world and ecosystem, and sort of go play on their playing field, play in their sandbox. And I think one of the challenges because I don't think a lot of organizations are at that place yet, is you've got security folks who are sort of communicating that they're in the way that they know how, saying, this is the thing that we need to do, these are our goals, this is our policy, this is the compliance requirement, et cetera, whatever the thing is. It's not all about compliance, and I'm certainly not implying that that's what everyone sort of thinks and acts and feels, but but there's like we need to sort of embrace a more developer minded empathy and language and framing in the way that we approach our problems and our opportunities, and I think like that is, if we can do that, and like zero trust and service mesh and all of that, that's one thing, but it trickles into the way that like software develop sort of build and deployment pipelines go. It trickles into the conversation around SBOMs. It trickles into the conversation around application security. It affects so much, because so much of our world is dominated by applications and services and data nowadays, that security folks, like as a discipline, I feel like we need to have a more developer forward sort of mindset and vernacular that we use to present ourselves and our priorities.
Yeah, you said the word that exactly was coming to my mind as you were speaking, that empathy, and it probably goes both ways, because the security community can show that towards developers, but at the same time, I mean, you all may mean word on the demo that we saw earlier. Ignacy showed how simple it is for a pretty significant bombshell exploit to like ruin an enterprise. So developers probably need to also understand how simple some of that stuff is, and it will bubble up on their radar a little bit. So empathy towards the concerns of the security professionals too.
For sure, but like the reason I mentioned, like I kind of put that on us, is we can control us, we can't control the other person, and so we need to, I think, do a better job in the way that we frame and we present and we like help developers in this case, sort of understand the kinds of risks that we're concerned with, understand the kind of opportunities that we have, and understand that we're willing to work with them on embracing these kind of this shift towards a more programmatic GitOps oriented modus operandi for our IT environments.
Yeah, awesome. Vishwas, you had commented, in our prep before that you'd love to also weigh in on kind of like the specific challenges you see in your org.
Sure. I mean,
or in general in the industry.
Yep, I think Robert and others Alex has already put in great points. The thing that I would say is this, the challenges that are being mentioned are not necessarily specific to zero trust, right? What we talked about, developer empathy or whatever else, right? What I'm seeing in security side of things, right? The way I look at it is we are developing or building towards security output, not security outcomes. And what I mean by that is, if I see a system that is doing vulnerability assessment, it does the vulnerability assessment, spews a bunch of output, right? Saying these are the 1,000 vulnerabilities. We're not seeing what happens next when somebody gets those 1,000 vulnerabilities. What do they have to do as a result? How do you make the outcome finally easy to achieve versus just providing output? And so when you're talking about service mesh and when you're talking about zero trust, I think one thing that we have to make sure is what you'd call shift up, making it very easy for different personas in this subsystem to do their own job. A developer does not know security, right? He's not going to be an expert in security. A security guy may know what policies he can apply in these environments. How do we let a security guy be able to inject these the information that he has, the policies that he knows about, the security compliance rules that he knows about, into a system that is fast flowing and dynamic and not inhibit a developer? And those are the kind of things that I find are issues in the developer case, right? I also find even despite imparting knowledge, telling them why things are hard or why they shouldn't be doing certain things in certain ways, we still find that developers do not go the way that a security team would expect. And what we found is if we give them that knowledge in their own ways or in their own tools, right? So as an example, if we tell them, hey, this thing can be exploited, right? You've left a SQL injection attack in your app, and it could be exploited. They understand it, but they still do not realize how easy it is for a hacker to come in. So if you had something on those lines, right, where you gave that developer itself tool saying, hey, why don't you hack your own system, and then they realize how easy it is for an adversary to come in, that's when they are able to sort of do it. So I think I agree with what Robert said. What I would say is, if I was to summarize, we need to let different personas do their job in their way. The tools have to be built, with different personas in mind, and we have to have developer empathy as we sort of has been mentioned earlier.
Awesome. I know this is, we didn't necessarily plan for Quint or Aradhna, to kind of wrap up with this question. You guys, have anything to add to this? I'll give you an opportunity to weigh in on, the challenges you saw if you want to weigh in on anything specific.
Yeah, sure. I'll give a quick, I know we're sort of short on time, but, I think for at least within Amazon, right, the developer experience sort of followed the same pattern as what I shared before, right? We made sure that that zero trust was the how and not the what, right? In this case, it turns out that understanding traffic flows is a super great tool for operational excellence, right? If you're running a service, you need to know who depends on your service and who the owners of those downstream things are, and what happens if the, and long story short, you're able to surface all of that great operational insight on the basis of the same systems that are providing and implementing, zero trust security, right? And I think that was a real powerful, again, sort of motivating factor to get everybody on board and build the momentum and the adoption, which ultimately I think is the real linchpin.
Yeah, it's probably safe to presume that has been successful. Then you've seen that adoption in your org.
Absolutely, 100%. I mean, like we, I don't want to, Amazon's been through many zero trust journeys long before it was a fashionable term, and focusing on adoption and motivations and incentives, I think has been key to all of those. And then lastly, before I turn it over, I got to stand up for the cloud. There's no two admin handshake double tap secret salute. Your data is and safe with us. SOC 2 assured.
Nice. Aradhna, you want to wrap up this last, or anything to add on this last kind of topic we're talking about?
Well, I did give credit that you must have behavioral analytics there, for cloud providers. I know Google has transparency logs and Azure has meshes as well, and so does AWS. I was just mentioning from an encryption strategy perspective. Yes, so I agree with all the panelists. There are challenges, but that's why we are here, right? To solve these challenges for the industry. I agree. In the greenfield applications, still I feel there are ways that we can put guardrails and pave roads for developers. There are policy management in CI/CD pipelines. We can enforce code quality and enforce bug bars and not allow their developers to be able to publish their code and deploy it. So that is a much easier problem solved with all the tools and technologies. It's just that enterprise need to start building those DevSecOps capabilities so teams can collaborate and build them for a smoother developer experience. No developer is going to know like hundreds of security policies and compliance rules that they need to check to deploy their code. So that's why we need to have enforcement built into the pipelines and the code itself. With OSCAL, we can have all the detection that we need and start enforcing those controls. It is the traditional applications where we still will have challenges, and that is going to be a journey. That's not going to happen overnight. It has to be a phased approach. Let's find the highest criticality resources and protect them first, and build whatever policies and policy enforcement points and intelligence we need to build around, and then continue to work through other resources iteratively until a solid state zero trust environment can be.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Thank you all for to participate on this. I myself even learned quite a bit. I think my big takeaway, right, it's principles, organizational change. It's not a product or one technology. And that's actually going to be the hardest thing, because organizational change, as we all know, is very, very hard. And I really like a couple of the points Rob brought out about the developer empathy, creating those paved paths, and finding the place to start, the pristine environment, maybe you could say the low-hanging fruit to start to move those over, get some great successes. So appreciate it all. Thank you for participating. And I saw Michaela pop in, so let's turn it to her to introduce kind of the concluding comments here.